Buddhism in the 21st century has become increasingly globalized. Therefore, a discussion that at once transcends nations and cultures, while drawing upon the rich tapestry of Buddhist diversity, will offer a unique opportunity to exchange perspectives on the changes and challenges for Buddhism today. The opportunity for creative discussions and shared explorations of Buddhist insights from different parts of the world will pave the way for future collaborations in shaping and propagating the timeless Buddhist values. Building a transnational and cross-cultural network of Buddhist communities is therefore considered a vital link in this process. In line with addressing this concern and realizing this potential, an international Buddhist conference on globalized Buddhism, titled Buddhism Without Borders, was held in the sacred settings of Bumthang Dzongkhag in Bhutan, the last standing Vajrayana kingdom and a bastion of living Buddhist traditions. The conference opened on the 21st of May this year. A luminary of eminent scholars, practitioners, and members of the international Buddhist community, selected on the basis of their work and academic credentials, engage in a process of intense yet wholesome exchange of visions, dreams, ideas, and creativity on pre-selected aspects of Buddhism. The conference was thus categorized into 6 themes. As a leader in the field of cultural and religious studies in Bhutan and the region, the Center for Bhutan Studies are the organizers of the conference in their continuing effort to bolster the critical position of Bhutan as the Mecca of the Buddhist world. The conference featured plenary presentations by keynote guest speakers, followed by thematic parallel discussions and participant interactions. At the end of the conference, the papers presented during the conference will be published as part of the proceedings. Kuzu Zampo, and a very good evening to all our viewers. This is your weekly dose of Buddhism, the Jangchub Shing, and I'm your host, Karma Dendup, for the next 1 hour. For those of you who are watching this program for the first time, every week we in BBS Channel 2 bring to the audience venerable Buddhist masters, scholars, and practitioners live whenever possible, and have the audience clear their doubts and questions. We have a very special guest on this episode of Jangchub Shing, but before I introduce you to her, we would like to convey our gratitude to the Center of Bhutan Studies for organizing an international conference on globalized Buddhism titled Buddhism Without Borders. Now, without wasting any more time, our guest on this episode of Jangchub Shing is Dr. Kathleen Gregory. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, Karma.
Bless. Let me take a few moments to introduce Dr. Kathleen to our viewers. Dr. Kathleen works in the School of Public Health at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, where she coordinates the Masters of Counselling program. She is a registered counselling psychologist and maintains a private practice. She has been a student of His Eminence Traleg Chubgin Rinpoche for nearly 20 years. She has an MA in psychoanalytic studies and has earned her PhD in 2009. Dr. Kathleen, again, welcome to our show, the Jangchub Shing.
Pleasure to be here.
My first question to you is, I was speaking to you before the show. Yes. I came to find out that this is your first visit to Bhutan.
That's right.
So could you share something about your experience here in Bhutan and your opinion or views, anything that you would like to share with the viewers on Bhutan?
Sure, happy to. Yes, as you said, it's my first visit here and very excited to come. And I guess for many Western people, Bhutan represents a kind of Shangri-La image, you know.
Yes.
And it's And as a Buddhist practitioner, as you said, only recently we were talking with some friends who are also Buddhist, and we were saying in Australia, to be a Buddhist is very private. You know, people have their own religions, but they practice in their own small communities.
Yes.
But to be in a country like Bhutan, which is a Buddhist country, and where everyone is a Buddhist and practices quite overtly, you see monks and nuns and religious people everywhere. You, in people's homes, we went to a restaurant, to a meal in a homestay. And there's a shrine there, there's always offerings. So this sense of really being in a Buddhist country is very inspiring and meaningful as a Buddhist to be here in Bhutan. And I think, speaking through with people at the conference and various other people that we've spoken with also, I mean, Bhutan is a very interesting place in its own history at this time, which is also evident in it's a modernizing country, and it's also very close to its traditions, but its modernizing is also very self-conscious and purposeful. So this is very interesting and curious to watch and to understand really how to bring particularly Buddhist principles self-consciously into the development of a society, and how that unfolds, and the task that is, and the responsibility, and how to hold that as a vision for a society on all levels is very interesting, inspiring, and a bit nerve-wracking, as I imagine it must be from the inside. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, how did you come about practicing Buddhism?
Yes.
Would you share something
Sure.
on how you were introduced to Buddhism and what made you turn towards Buddhism?
Sure. I was brought up in a Catholic, and my family weren't particularly religious, but we attended church. I went to a Catholic school, and my parents were always quite active, in the church, in helping others and doing charitable work. So that was the kind of environment that I grew up in. But I guess as I got older myself, I tended to drift away more from Catholicism, and which is what the experience of many Westerners is, that somehow the church and the way it's practiced and so on began to not have so much meaning for me. So Buddhism kind of existed, I guess, for me, on the edges. It's there, and you kind of have a little bit of interest in it, but not quite sure. And I had, in the different ways that Buddhism comes into the West, there's often retreats, and those things are very attractive for Westerners. For my own case, happy to share that in my early 30s I got quite sick, and I think that really propelled me very fast to think about the meaning of my own life and the purpose, and that really set me on my course, I think, to try and find a spiritual practice for myself. And Buddhism, as I said, had kind of been on the edges of my interest. I had, a few books on Buddhism. I had, listened to a few things here and there, but I think it propelled me forward. And then I sought out to do a retreat, and had the good fortune to do a retreat with Pema Chodron, who who is quite influential in the West, and I never looked back, so they say. I really made a connection from there.
You were speaking to us about the experience of Bhutan and seeing that every house has an altar, and it's almost like a living tradition.
Yes.
So coming back to the conference that I also had the good fortune of participating in, the topic that you spoke on was Buddhism as a living tradition.
Yes.
So if you could share with the audience what that topic was about and why you chose that topic.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's a good question. The topic I chose grew out of my reflections of being a Buddhist practitioner in the West, and probably to give some challenge to some of the ways that even myself as a Westerner and we in the West, this is a broad category, of course, when we say West, we perceive of Buddhism. And, having been a student of Trali Khapkon Rinpoche now for 20 years, and who's very, like many of the Tibetan masters who've come to the West, are very keen to present the tradition of Buddhism, but also very reflective of contemporary experience. And that is how I've learnt Buddhism. So this notion of it being a living system, that it will always necessarily reflect our contemporary experience because it exists in our minds. It exists, so it will always be affected by human subjectivity in time and place. So Buddhism being in the West is only so as an incidence, in space and time, so to speak. But we have particular perceptions from the West that we impose on Buddhism. So we think there are differences, there's texts and there's practice. But of course in Buddhism, the texts, they are about our human experience, so we read them and they become our practice. Yes. So this divide is somewhat, that border, I guess, between text and practice is somewhat broken down. In the same way, often in the West there's a perception of wanting to modernize Buddhism to the extent that you can throw out a lot of even the traditional values, that it's not seen as contemporary. But I think if we understand, as I have learnt Buddhism, that it is really a living system in human beings, then that divide between the contemporary and the present, and then the ancient, beg my pardon, the ancient and contemporary is also broken down because it's always living through human beings and passed down from one human being to another. And I think then this really challenges the divide that's very strong in the West between tradition and innovation. In the West, notions of tradition are seen as being out of mode, or you just hold on to something from the past for the sake of it. People who are traditional are seen as being conservative or out of touch. Yes. Where if you understand Buddhism as a living tradition, it's alive, it's always innovating. So again, I think this notion of it being a living system challenges that divide of tradition and innovation, which is a strong border from the Western perspective.
Yes. Your work as a psychologist,
yes.
I take it that since you're a practitioner for over 20 years now, how has it influenced the way you practice your therapy sessions, or if you could share something on that?
Sure. Yes, I've been a psychologist a little bit longer than I've been a little bit longer than I've been a Buddhist, and sometimes maybe a little hard to know when one begins and the other ends. But I think Buddhism has been very important for me in terms of how I think about the work of psychotherapy. Certainly you have to understand, that psychotherapy is not necessarily a spiritual, context. It may lead people to ask those kinds of questions, but this is, so it is a secular frame within which we can bring some Buddhist ideas to that. And from my experience, I think I would say that often the thing that has been often overemphasized in the West when we think of bringing Buddhism and psychotherapy together is the practice of mindfulness. Like, this has really been seen as a real technique to help people deal with their agitated minds, or sad or depressed or angry mind, that you could develop a technique to help people work with their condition in that way. But really the whole of the canon and the Buddha's teachings, which, as we were saying before, really deal with our living situation. They help us understand how we are and who we are as human beings. And that, to me, is the most therapeutic that it can really bring. Often people feel confused about their experiences. So, often people come to see me and maybe they know I'm a Buddhist, so they may have some interest in Buddhism, and they'll say, oh, I don't want to be angry. Or, I should be kind to everyone. And, not really understanding that these emotions arise we have to work with them. You can't you can't just decide to not be angry.
Yes.
This doesn't work. You have to work with them. So these understandings that I think Buddhism brings about our human condition, and how we are as human beings, how we have to work with our emotions and understand the impermanent nature in a very meaningful way, in an ordinary way, is I think the kinds of perspectives for me that really Buddhism enriches the work of psychotherapy.
In your experience of coordinating the Master of Counselling program in your university, could you share with us what is it that you do there?
Okay.
Like firstly, so that I better
get
understand
the
what
sense
you
of
do.
that. I understand. Okay. So the Master of Counselling is a training program for people who want to be counsellors, to be professional counsellors. So there are a variety of subjects that they need to undertake in relation to that. So many of the people, because it is a master's level, people may already have a degree or have another profession, and they are looking to do a career change. And maybe they've been working in a role like as a family support worker or something where counselling has been part of their job. So they're wanting to really establish themselves as a professional counsellor. So in coordinating that program, I oversee the development of that, and the main areas that I teach in to do with an important component of counselling is ethics. So I teach ethics, and this is also where I bring my Buddhism experience in there, because I think Buddhist ethics are really have a lot to offer in terms of understanding how we develop ourselves. So I introduce Buddhism in my teaching in that subject in particular. But the notion, learning counselling involves learning about ethics. It involves learning about different mental health presentations, and it learns a lot about learning the skill of being able to really listen and be helpful to people through applying different kinds also of understandings to why someone is coming to see you.
Yes. So the fact, given the fact that you coordinate these counselling programs, is there? It must. How long are these courses?
So the program is 2 years.
2 years.
Yes.
So for our Bhutanese counsellors who are watching this show, is there something that you can briefly tell them, or something that you can share so that they learn from your vast experience as a coordinator of these programs?
Okay. That's a big question. I think... Yes, go on. Yes.
Like basic core ethics, or like the area that you teach in. Could you share something with the Bhutanese counsellors who are watching this show?
Yeah. Well, if I was to talk about the ethics, and I'm not sure how the counsellors learn about ethics in Bhutan, but in psychotherapy training in the West, when you learn ethics, what you learn is the code of practice, all the things that you should try and avoid doing, and the different dilemmas that can arise when you work, and the principles to do with duty of care and these kinds of things. So there's lots of emphasis given on those things, which we need to know, and these are part of being a professional.
For you personally, what do you feel like, from amongst all of these ethics? I'm sure it's a long list.
So I'm not going to say all of them, no. So from a Buddhist view, I guess, for me, I think what Buddhism really offers for us as psychotherapists is the development of the kind of characteristics and virtues that we need to help us be of help to others. And this is not really always emphasised so much in the Western perspective. And I think this is a real, for people who are counsellors in Bhutanese, this will be a very natural connection. But from a Western perspective, this is, not unnatural, but to actually have a system that helps you understand how to develop yourself in a way that you will be of more help than harm to others is really about ethical practice. And in particular, the 6 paramitas, 6 transcendental actions of patience and generosity, wisdom, and these are very important, I think, for counsellors to help them think about the way that they're developing themselves And to think about the way also those things can be challenged in counselling, you know, because sometimes you can work with people that challenge your patience. You know, they say they want to make some change or do these things, and, you know, they're really stuck in their old habits. So how to have skillful patience with someone like that, you know. So I think, you know, the understanding from Buddhism in terms of ethical practice in this way is very helpful.
Yes. Keeping the doctor-patient confidentiality thing in mind, is there an experience or a patient who kind of tested you, and, you know, who, because like every experience in life, with my own personal experience, it's a two-way learning process.
Absolutely.
So is there something that is close to your heart, or an experience without naming anybody? If you could share something, some experience that you had in your practice.
I think often for me, when you asked that question, a few people came to mind. And, you know, there's a young woman that I've worked with for quite a long time. And she has a lot of emotional problems. And one of the things that happens in her coming to see me is that it means her life is a little bit chaotic. So she sometimes cancels her appointment at the last minute or doesn't turn up. And, you know, so I have a tight diary. So this is, you know, tries my patience, and also how to, you know, have that firmness with her, but also to give her some space, because I understand that she really has quite a lot of problems that she is working through. And I find Buddhism helps me enormously to work with patience in that way, and also to have, I hope, to try to cultivate very genuine sense of compassion for her, that this is the state of mind she is in. And the way I experience her is probably how most people experience her in a life. So probably many people will reject her. You know, many people would kind of give up on her. So I try and bring that sense to my work with her, to have a sense of compassion and try to stay with it, because it would be easy to give up. So I think this is how Buddhism helps me enormously.
Yes. I have to share I would like to share a personal observation that I've made growing up here in Bhutan. That in Bhutan, it is not difficult, or rather it's very easy for Bhutanese couples to get a divorce. And paradoxically, most of the marriages in Bhutan, unlike the neighboring countries, like in India, you have the prevalent tradition and culture there is to have arranged marriages. In Bhutan, it's pretty much, say, 99% of the marriages that happen are love marriages. So it always kind of baffles me that, okay, people fall in love, they get married, and within a span of sometimes a year, it's almost like a Hollywood celebrity marriage. So with your experience in psychoanalysis, is there anything that you could share about what could be going wrong there?
Oh, it's a big question, Connor. I think it's a big question for all societies, isn't it? You know, and you mentioned Hollywood, which I think is a kind of important context, certainly in Western societies, that, you know, the romantic ideal, you know, so there's the falling in love, which is the really big thing. But then there's the reality of, you know, two people living together and managing shared life and an independent life, and, you know, these things. So I think the context of Hollywood is quite important to, that has fed some of our fantasies and, you know, myths around what marriage really is. And I think, you know, really a marriage takes work and commitment, and give and take. And this is often very hard. You know, there's often a power struggle in marriages, in terms of people thinking, you know, the other one gets their way more than me, or, you know, and that willingness to compromise. So I think, you know, those kinds of things are the work of a marriage, and opening up communication. I recently, if I could share an example, I saw a young couple, and they had quite a tragedy happen to them, and they were only like 6 months together. And the young man, they came a number of times, but he said to me, I realize now, when this is what we were doing in the counselling was this is what communication means. You talk about what you feel. You talk about what you're thinking about, or what your hopes are, or what your fears are. And sometimes this can be, this is what is the foundation of a marriage, this very open communicating around things. And sometimes we have to learn those things, maybe because of our own family situations or even our own cultural contexts or whatever, to really, we assume a lot of things. They often talk in marriage counselling that one partner expects the other one to be able to mind read, that you just have to know what I'm thinking, where we have to learn to communicate to each other about what we're feeling and thinking, and the other to hear it and not to have that openness with each other. But I think without that, then it seems sometimes divorce is maybe just from misunderstanding or lack of communicating, and just people have no base to work from. So I don't know if that is helpful to think about, but that's my observation.
Yes. We were speaking about couples divorcing. Now, when, although it's a tragedy that couples can't work it out, or there is too much expectations from one side of the children that are born out of these broken marriages, like from your field of study and with psychoanalysis, is there anything that you could share about like a general thing that children from divorced couples, what do they experience, and if you could share something about how an advice or some counseling that you could give for the children who are born out of these broken marriages?
Yes, no, that's a good question, because I think divorce itself is not, it can happen, and and if a couple can't work it out, that's what can happen. I think the worst thing that can happen, and we see this in the West, and I don't know if this happens here in Bhutan, but sometimes if it has become very difficult between the couple, then sometimes one of the part will use the children against the other. This is the worst thing that can really happen to children. The most important thing, of course, for children is to have a sense that they continue to be loved, that what happens with their parents is not to do with them. Because especially young children, they are learning things, so they think everything might be to do with them.
They could blame themselves.
They blame themselves. So it's very important that it is communicated to children that, something has happened between the mother and father, but it's nothing to do with the children, that the children are still loved, and that sense of stability and continuity is still maintained with both parents, if possible, with the child. So with that kind of base, then it's very important then, of course, that one parent doesn't use the children against, because you can sometimes see this happen. One of the parents says, "Your mother's terrible," and kind of pulls the child in, and what we call in the West creates the triangle. Really should just be between the parents, and that the child, the interest of the child, are kept, that both
separate.
Parents can be joined to care still about this, and kept separate.
In spite of their differences.
In spite of the difference, the interest of the child. But if you, what we call triangulate, so you have the parent, the child, and the other parent kind of in a power or fighting, this is not good for the child at all. And in the West there is lots of family mediation centres, so that to stop this, and whatever way might be possible here to, if people are finding it difficult, that they get some support to help them, so that the child is not triangulated, as we say.
Yes. In Bhutan right now, the youth, given the fact that we are in transition, television has come in, the world, the internet, and it's so much for the youth, even for us who grew up without these facilities before. And a growing problem now is the youth, and the fact that we have an increasing problem of substance abuse.
Yes.
So is there anything that doctor could share with your counseling experience on why or how do children get into substance abuse? And I have a follow-up question, as in what would you advise to somebody who's into these abusing substances?
Yes. Yeah, and this is a big problem through the world, yes? In terms, and I think for young people, as you say, there's lots of changes in society, and particularly here in Bhutan, of course, that are happening quite rapidly in lots of ways, and that bring very different perspectives about what might be possible, what kinds of things we might expect, and then the reality of how we find our situations. So these differences can create, can make people vulnerable to feeling disappointed or frustrated or so on. I mean, it's certainly, in the Western context, drug taking is often part of an experimental period for teenagers also, and it's a form of, breaking with the traditions and breaking with parents and so on. And, there are often a portion of young people who will try drugs and maybe just try it a few times and have no interest and will stop. And then there's others who sometimes seriously can develop addiction problems. And even some people, another smaller population that probably may even get mental health issues. So what we call drug-induced psychosis. So sometimes this can create real problems. Addiction's a very difficult situation. And I think, it is a social problem in the sense that it is often experienced by people who feel somewhat marginalised or alienated in some kind of way, or give up hope. So that sense of being able to cultivate a sense of worth and a sense of purpose and hope are very important for people who suffer with addiction, as it is also to deal with develop ways of restraining oneself, because the addicted substance is addictive. I mean, it's very, and it's often associated with particular lifestyle and friendship and peer pressure and all those kinds of things. So we talk often in terms of cycles of addiction, that people may get on top of their addiction for a while, but, the pull back can be quite strong. And then again, they find themselves back in it, and then again something may happen and they come out again. But it's often, things have to get sometimes quite desperate for people to be able to really stop the cycle. So I think it's very, very difficult for people, your family and friends around you, and sometimes people get into stealing money from their family, or, desperate measures to maintain this addiction. And I'm aware there are, of course, rehabilitation centres here, and that they're very important. And also, particularly if you meet with someone there who's also had similar experience, this can be often most supportive, because they understand those cycles. And, to work with that real pull of the addiction is very difficult. So I think, as I said before, and kind of using Buddhist principles of cultivation, that we need to cultivate purpose, a sense of worth. And it's a challenge in our society, because those things, in fact, have become, what measures success and that have become very high. And, we want to have 5 minutes of fame, or we, want to be very rich, or we want to have this kind of car. All of the ways as societies are now measuring a human's sense of worth, and that have become very material and very external. So to bring us back to a sense of being a good person or a kind person, or having a sense of bringing value to whatever kind of work we're engaged in our life, or wherever we find ourselves, is a very important to build that sense of confidence and cultivate a sense of worth, which is really the counter to the pull of the addiction, which is always takes us to that place where we feel the worst about ourselves, where we feel negative, or give up hope and so on.
Yes. Another youth-related question that I have is unemployment. And do you get patients who are going through who are frustrated because they don't have a job, or maybe with the global recession that happened?
Yes.
Of course, people
Yes.
don't have money to pay for
Yes.
the therapy also.
Not necessarily come to see me. I used to be a youth worker a long time ago, so I'm very familiar with young people, and
Yes.
and I think unemployment is a very it's very difficult because
This could lead into substance abuse and other
absolutely because you're very vulnerable.
things.
To have what I was saying before in terms of that sense of self-worth. How it is measured, that is very vulnerable to substance abuse, because you begin to feel depressed or hopeless and helpless about changing your situation. And I think unemployment is very difficult, and it's interesting because it really points to that, what you could say in human beings, that there is a kind of desire to be to be engaged with things, to feel that one's making a contribution. And so I think this is the counter, that what people experience in relation to unemployment tells us something about a very natural human endeavour to be engaged and to be purposeful and to be occupied in those kinds of ways. Certainly, people doing volunteer work and those things, need to build things. And I think that is also one of the problems we have a bit now, isn't it? We're very impatient. We want things to happen quickly. And to understand, if one finds oneself in a period of unemployment, how to slowly work through and out of that. It won't happen overnight necessarily. That, we need to build our confidence. We need to maybe do some volunteer work to kind of have a sense of the kind of work we might want to do, or some direction. But it takes time to work with that.
So in a way, you're kind of advising people who are viewers who are watching this show who are unemployed to occupy your time and be patient.
Yes.
It does take time, and
Yes.
I think a good point that our viewers can take from there is the fact that if you can engage yourself in some volunteerism,
Yes.
then that might also lead to your area of interest, something that you would want to do, rather than dwelling upon the fact that you're unemployed and then go into negative aspects.
Absolutely.
A final youth-related question that I have is, so many people attributed to cinema the fact that there is a Korean film which is based on gangs called The Crow or something like that. But Bhutan, and especially the urban centers, we're facing, it was quite rampant, but now the law enforcement, and there are many programs which are helping out. But there is a rise in youth grouping together, groupism. So is there anything that you can share with us about why this could be happening, or what would you advise to somebody, say, if I was in a gang, if I was a gang member and I had come for counseling to you, what would your advice be?
I think yes, this is interesting, and the thing that, of course, there can be different kinds of gangs, but I guess we're talking about gangs where there creates a kind of negative influence on each other. What psychology calls groupthink. It's like the kind of the most the worst kind of thinking rises to the top, so to speak. That everyone agrees, even if maybe it involves doing some vandalism or something like this. But the groupthink becomes stronger, and those who may be resistant or against that idea kind of get suppressed or don't speak out. So I think the notion of gangs can be important, and I guess in the context of what we've been talking about in terms of unemployment and substance abuse. So it's a very natural progression that people then become part of a community. A gang is like a community for people. And this is, how to acknowledge that sense of belonging that's important there, the sense of identity, a sense of worth, a sense of shared values. I mean, all of these things are what the gang provides, and these are also important for all of us to have a sense of in our lives too. So where else might those be able to be cultivated or found in one's life? And I guess partly too, to have a sense of discriminating for oneself, to have the confidence to discriminate what's good for oneself and what's bad for oneself is a very important skill to develop. And I think, the groupthink is what kind of suppresses that in some ways. So, how to... And I guess what happens is we want to... I don't know how to say this, but how to look for the positive that is in that, as I said, in terms of that someone is seeking belonging, identity, shared values. And so how can we work with those kinds of things to help maybe create another context or situation which would be of more benefit and more positive rather than that kind of context that those kind of values and things are formed around more negative behaviours and thinking.
Yes. As a kind of like closing this psychotherapy question and answer session, anything that you would like to tell Bhutanese parents who are dealing with youth who are either involved in substance abuse or are involved in a gang or who might be unemployed? Is there, what counselling would you give to Bhutanese parents?
I mean, every situation has its own unique, qualities.
Yes,
so to give general, it can be difficult. But I think, so my first response to that is to really have a sense of empathy for parents, because I think it's very difficult we're talking about ethics and patience and generosity, to work out what is the, how much patience to have for if your child is involved in those kinds of things, and when to be firm and have discipline, and what firm boundaries that you need to have, and how to also keep a sense of love, because this is also important, because, it's I was thinking Buddhism is the middle way, if you go too stern, it becomes too punishing. And that doesn't give either the parent or the child somewhere to come back from.
Yes.
But if you go too soft, if you let them just keep doing whatever they're doing and stealing from you or whatever, this is no good either, because they're not, having any boundaries or taking some responsibility. So somewhere this middle ground between, having firmness and love is the most general advice, and
to go about it.
Yes, to go about it, and that is a challenge, and I think the thing for parents, it's always moving, So you think you might have just worked it out, you even think, oh, this will be enough, and then there might be another challenge. So you have to kind of be in process with it in that way, because But I think to have that. To try to work with that tension between love and firmness is really the best advice.
Of course, the doctor mentioned that every case is, specific. There'll be details and counselling which would work for that particular case.
Right.
But in a general way, like a message, like a last message to our viewers, youth viewers, anything that you would like to share, maybe along the lines of with your counselling experience, or maybe with your experience in practicing Buddhism, about the kind of culture and tradition that we have here. Because I was interviewing a professor from Canada in this conference, and he was saying it's the same. In the West, you have youth who are kind of like looking to the East because it's foreign, everything Oriental. In that very similar way, in Bhutan, we have the youth who are looking towards the West or looking at other cultures. So is there anything that you would, from your side, like to tell the Bhutanese youth?
Well, I think we live in a time when we have so much available to us. We're exposed to so many different perspectives, and if we think of being a young person as that natural time of exploration and identity formation, so it's very natural that we start to look out and want to reject our own traditions and our own past and look to the new. And I think this is a very natural, understood in Western psychology, is quite natural. But I think, what in Bhutan you have is a very strong sense of values, and Buddhism really provides a very practice for living. That I think if I understand, in the West we may reject things because we also don't have a strong base to draw from in terms of a value system and a perspective that helps us understand how we are and how to live in our environments and with others. So I'm not quite sure how to say this, but I mean in some ways that it is a different situation, I think, here in Bhutan, and how, as a young person, I imagine having been affected by the Buddhist ideals and knowing how important they are in one's life, and also working with the kinds of aspirations and ideals that Western perspectives bring. Again, maybe we're back to the middle way in some way, isn't it?
Yes.
How do we work with, not rejecting to extreme and accepting the other? Because I think this is the challenge of globalization in some way, that we find some kind of middle ground and work with the tension that is there. And that's a big task. And I guess my only message is one of empathy and sympathy in some way. That's very in Bhutanese society. That's quite a big challenge for young people to kind of bear that,
Yes.
to work with that.
Yes. Doctor, now going back to Buddhism, I mean,
Yes.
of course, everything that the doctor has been speaking about has been about Buddhism.
Yes. I think so.
And I mean, the question that I always begin my show with,
Yes.
whenever I have a Tibet, I mean, the question that I always begin my show with most lamas is who was or is the Buddha, or what is the Buddha? So to you, with your vast experience of over 2 decades as a Buddhist practitioner, the term Buddha or what is or who is the Buddha to you?
I think from my paper at the conference, and I think from a living tradition perspective, what for me, and I guess because I'm a psychologist and so try to bring Buddhism and psychology together, what I find I have emphasized for me in terms of the Buddha is he is a human being. And as someone who really, through his own efforts, set out to understand the human condition, to understand human suffering, and with a singular concern to try and bring relief to that suffering. So for me, he represents, he is a human being, and that his example demonstrates that for anyone with the right effort and instruction and can for themselves understand the human condition and liberate themselves from the kinds of sufferings that he recognized, through his teachings and so on. So I think that if that is the most way it works for me to think as a psychotherapist, particularly.
Have you always had that perception of the Buddha, or was it when you initially started out, did you think of the Buddha as maybe a God figure?
I mean, coming from a theistic background, it's very easy to do that and to kind of put him way outside of human experience. And I think this is the very interesting process of being a Buddhist, that in a sense that's what you come to. And it's still the hard work,
Yes.
and you need a teacher that helps you and inspires you. But I think, really this is the journey to become a Buddhist, is to really understand that.
And after 20 years, do you feel that you're any closer to enlightenment or further away from enlightenment?
Oh, that's an unfair question, Karma. I don't know. I think, you see, in some ways, you begin two things, I think, reflecting on that question, come to mind. One is that I think, you think you know Buddhism a little bit, and you kind of think you can get away with things. You know what I mean? Like you think you can kind of, I'll just indulge that angry thought about someone. Yeah. And then you realise, oh no, I'm creating that mind stream all the time. I should, so there's something changes where you begin to take a little bit more responsibility. But I don't know if that's to do with getting closer to enlightenment, but I just think that it's, there's a way of feeling more responsibility towards oneself.
And a final closing question. Of course, given the fact that I'm sure Tralig, I have to admit that I am not familiar with Tralig Chögyam Rinpoche, but he is a Vajrayana master. So the fact that so many of Vajrayana teaching is considered and is supposed to be secret, without giving away any secret instruction or advice that Rinpoche must have shared with you or other teachers must have, what kind of inspires you, or which is, like, from the 84,000 volumes of teaching that the Buddha taught, is there something that works for you every day in your practice, or in your life? If you could share something on that with our viewers.
Maybe I'm going to go from one extreme to the other. When I commenced my PhD, I asked Rinpoche, what I should read, and he said I should read Abhidharma. I was a bit depressed, but I think this is what has made much more sense to me in understanding human mind, and that, as a psychologist, of course, but as a human being, this has been really profoundly important, and I really find the Abhidharma has really inspired me to understand. Because I guess particularly in the West there's a lot of emphasis around enlightenment and all the kind of development of compassion, but we have to work with our ignorant mind, our angry mind, and Abhidharma shows us all, details all of those things. So I find the Abhidharma very inspiring and helpful. And I think, teachings on the Bodhisattva way are very inspiring also, to really bring a sense of purposefulness, that to really try to embody as much as one can that sense of being of help to others is really what rounds off a kind of sense of being a spiritual practitioner for me.
Yes. I did say last question.
Okay, now you have another one.
A final last question, which is actually, I normally ask this to Buddhist teachers, but still, since you've been practicing Buddhism for so long, what do you, in brief, because we're running short of time also, as always, discussing Buddhism is, even it used to be a half-an-hour show, now it's 1 hour, but it's still short. So, to you, what is the Buddha Dharma to you?
Well, I think, maybe I'm sounding repetitive, but I think it is about how to be a human being. How to be the best kind of human being that we can be. And the only way to that is to know how we are normally, ordinarily, and to cultivate other characteristics and aspects. But it's really about how to be a human being.
Thus, Dr. Kathleen Gregory, thank you so much for being my guest on Jangchub Shing.
Pleasure. Thank you, Carl.
And I hope you have a pleasant stay, and we wish to see you again.
Me
and
too,
take from your vast experience both in psychoanalysis and also in Buddhism.
Thank you.
Thus, as always, from everybody here at Chubachu and from me, your host, Karma Dendrup, good night and take care. And please don't forget our Jangchub Shing slogan, analyze and realize.